Here, we're going to go over some of the thought of Søren Kierkegaard, and I'm just going to highlight a few elements of what the text has us take a close look at, which are some of the most important, meaningful, and substantial elements of Kierkegaard's thought. So here we go. One of the things that you'll notice from the reading is that, actually, let me go back to the key concepts, is Kierkegaard has this view, this perspective of different sort of stages of life that people who are facing life's absurdity, you might say, are kind of move through. There's the aesthetic. Now, if you're not familiar with that word, aesthetic has to do with the artistic, or elements that or aspects of life that relate to beauty, or the artistic, right? Things that are appealing in their physical, impression on us, right? We might imagine existentialists are oftentimes drawn to that because, once again, we had talked about existentialism as an earthy philosophy, or an earthy outlook, right? Trying to avoid the abstract and moving instead towards what is knowable, what is more concrete, what we experience in this life. All right. Well, then, and then Kierkegaard then. Oh, when we go to the text, and then we'll pick up. Our text has us having describes the aesthetic stage this way: inspired by an understanding of art history from Hegel's lectures on aesthetics. Now, oh yeah, let me share a little bit about Hegel. Hegel was a early 19th century philosopher whose most well-known work, Phenomenology of Spirit, was published in 1807. So this is a few decades before Kierkegaard is writing. And Hegel, one of the ways of characterizing Hegel's understanding is as a sort of dialectic idealism. That there's a lot to unpack related to that, and this is not Hegel is not necessarily, he's not an existentialist, as it were, but his understanding of thought as a sort of like a back and forth conversation. Let's try this. This doesn't work. Okay, let's try that. That didn't work. Let's try this. So one of the ways Hegel's model of the history of the human intellect and our pursuit of the absolute is described as a sort of back and forth between some sort of thesis, some sort of idea or proposition that we try historically, and then then discovering that doesn't really work satisfactorily, we might try the opposite, or some sort of antithesis or antithesis of that. And then we find out that doesn't work. So we then sometimes go somewhere in the middle between the thesis and the antithesis, and we end up with some sort of synthesis, some sort of combination of those ideas. So Hegel thought that history can sort of be accounted for, and our progress towards an understanding of ultimate truth can be understood as a dialectic between some sort of given thesis, some sort of suggestion about what will work, but then that countered when we find out it doesn't totally work with some sort of antithesis, and then so on and so forth. We can actually think about much of history in that way. It became a very useful, and still is a kind of useful way of thinking about human history, as a sort of, let's try this, didn't work, let's try that didn't work, so let's go somewhere in the middle, and then so on and so forth, right? And we end up with progressive movements, like the notion that we should centralize liberty. That's the idea that we should base our society and our government on the prioritization of liberty and justice, as a and those two principles being part of the core goals of a government. That's actually a fairly recent idea. So but Hegel points out that seems to come as the result of many centuries, indeed many millennia, of trying different ways, trying different systems of government, until finally we arrive at where we are now, but we're still progressing. We're still trying to figure things out through this process. All right, that's enough on Hegel. So Kierkegaard is interested in this, right? And even though it is the case that Kierkegaard criticized Hegel, he didn't think that Hegel was largely right, partially because Kierkegaard thought that Hegel was a little too abstract. He was a little too kind of idealistic, a little too far in the attempt to find some sort of absolute that is kind of social, that is a little bit more, I think I already used the word universal. But Kierkegaard doesn't find that very appealing because Kierkegaard, again, wants to focus on my individual existence, my individual experience alive in this world. So, all right. So nevertheless, oh gosh, I spent way too much time talking about that. So Kierkegaard is nevertheless, as much as Kierkegaard dismisses Hegel, he appreciates Hegel quite a bit, and certainly Hegel's view of the aesthetic or the artistic expression informs Kierkegaard's understanding of that as well. So the first stage that Kierkegaard describes is the aesthetic, right? So the focus on pleasure, on what's visibly appealing, on the magnificence of the arts, and there is a lot of value to this, right? So, and this is the case. I had a couple of students who did a really good project, did a research project that they presented as a podcast. It's Hannah and Katie. So just to point out that it was a really excellent podcast that focused on the value of one of the aesthetics, which is high quality, delicious food that can end up, connecting people, that enables people to really understand each other and enjoy life together while they're enjoying this a lovely meal with lovely flavors. So there's great value to the aesthetic, to the artistic, to pleasure. It's not simply about hedonism. It's not simply about gluttony. It's not really that. It's more about appreciating the exquisiteness of good art, right? And sometimes that art is food, right? Sometimes that art is graphic. Sometimes it is music. Right? These are things that make life very enjoyable and add meaning to it. But the aesthetic is not satisfactory ultimately. So I'm going to skip a little bit towards the kind of end where things end up. So at one point, our author writes, Kierkegaard has A is the character, the aesthete, right? The person who is the thinking about art or trying to base their life on art. A has to admit that the aesthetic lifestyle is empty. Something more is needed. Right? So, quoting, if I were to offer all the glories of the world or all its pain, the one would move me as little as the other. If I might behold a constancy that could withstand every trial, an enthusiasm that endured everything, a faith that could remove mountains, a thought that could unite the finite and the infinite. But my soul's poisonous doubt is all-consuming. My soul is like the Dead Sea, over which no bird can fly. When it has flown midway, then it sinks down to death and destruction. Right? Okay, so the art seems to kind of result in something that is ultimately not satisfying, something that doesn't really help us to resolve life's absurdity. All right, then Kierkegaard moves on to the ethical, right? So if we reject the aesthetic and move and progress to the ethical, then we could start to think about, and Kierkegaard borrows a lot from Immanuel Kant. I'm going to put some literature and some guides up related to Kant. There's already a content module on Kant, so I invite you to visit that. But I still need to add a few more things. But it's going to include a little bit of a review of Kant's system of ethics, Kantianism as it's sometimes called. So Kierkegaard uses that as a sort of formulation of what the aesthetic lifestyle, or I'm sorry, what the ethical lifestyle looks like, but then discovers that there are conflicts that end up emerging from a dedication to living ethically as well. And here we end up with the sort of third stage, the rejection of the universality of ethics, and instead turning things on the individual in this kind of absurdness. Kant, like Hegel, Kant is also a little bit too universalizing, a little bit too abstract, a little bit too far beyond what my individual subjective experience of the world relates to, or how to. They don't help me orient myself here in this kind of rugged existence that I have, in which there are many things and many experiences that are not ultimately explainable. And here I'm going to go over to something that I put up on the LMS. Kierkegaard is he's puzzled by this passage in Scripture that some of you, if you're familiar with Scripture, you might know well. This is when God tests Abraham. So I'm gonna go through this. You'll see it's under Kierkegaard and under Key Concepts. If you scroll down a little bit, there's the passage that I've pasted from straight from Genesis 22, and it's a text from Genesis 22. But have a look at this. God tested Abraham. He said to Abraham, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Okay, so basically God is telling Abraham to kill his son, right? His son who he loves, right? Now this is a major challenge for Abraham. Abraham is tormented by this, as Kierkegaard will describe. All right, but then and then it sort of continues that Abraham is willing to go through with it. Right? At the very bottom, when they reached there, the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there, arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. There he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now, I didn't include the rest of the passage. Now, you might be familiar with the rest of the story. God stops him and says, "Okay, here's an offering. Here's a ram, and that will suffice for the offering." God stops Abraham. Abraham doesn't have to go through with it and kill his son, but he's right about he's going to do it, and that's what Kierkegaard's interested in. Abraham, he has he's conflicted because he loves his son, but yet he as a man of faith, he understands that God is telling him to sacrifice his son, which is morally wrong, right? We would say that we no longer sacrifice humans anymore because we think that it's morally problematic, it's morally wrong. All right, let me go over to how Kierkegaard describes this. So this is Kierkegaard's own writing here, translated by Walter Lowry. But this is from one of Kierkegaard's most known works, Fear and Trembling. Right? All right. Okay, so Kierkegaard, as he's describing, he points out the ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he would murder Isaac. He intended to, if we're thinking in terms of morality, well, when you kill somebody who does not want to be killed, then that counts as murder. If in this case, right? So if we're just thinking morally, I mean, imagine. I mean, we think about this. There are examples of this regularly when people feel as though God is telling them to kill somebody, and then they kill somebody. Well, we don't think in general. I mean, this actually one example that comes to mind sometimes is the two girls who felt like this was a few years ago, I think in Wisconsin. There are a couple of girls who felt like Slender Man. You may remember Slender Man. This is a kind of mythology that developed in I think originally in creepypasta, some online forum where people would write and post fiction. And so some people came to suspect that maybe Slender Man, this creepy, literally a slender man, was like meddling in their lives and would freak people out. But there were two girls who really thought that Slender Man wanted them to kill their friend, and they tried to kill her. They stabbed her a bunch of times. The girl fortunately ended up surviving, but the friends really did seem to believe that Slender Man told them to kill this person. Now, this is very difficult because we all, I think all of us here would say, well, they should not have listened to Slender Man or what they thought was Slender Man. And the girls were on trial for attempted murder, right? As they should have been, right? This is the ethical expression for that. Okay. But then the religious, Kierkegaard goes on, the religious expression is that he would sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction, consists the dread, right? Now, dread is one of the core concepts that we're going to be looking at as part of existentialism, as one of the recurring themes in existentialism, because this is a kind of like this is a torment. I can't believe that I'm being expected to commit this act, right? As it exists the dread which can make a man sleepless, and yet Abraham is not what he is without this dread, right? The reason why it was a challenge is because Abraham was dreading it. Now, the girls who tried to kill their friend because they thought that Slenderman told them to do it, they might not have been in that kind of turmoil. They might not have experienced that sort of dread. In other words, it might not have necessarily been out of heroic faith that they did it. Rather, it was more an act of murder or and based on a delusion. Kierkegaard's not talking about delusion here. He's talking about something a little bit more profound, a little bit more existential. Use that word. All right. Okay, I'm gonna skip down a little bit. Let's see. So in other words, if we were just looking at this ethically, then yeah, it's murder. But if we're looking at it from a standpoint of faith, it's sacrifice, because Abraham is uh, is conflicted about this. He doesn't want to do it, but he's going to do it anyway. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead in the interest of time. Sorry, I'm a little bit long-winded here. Second place amounts. Okay. Okay, notice here comes the word dialectic again. Remember when we were talking about Hegel? Dialectic was part of Hegel's view. It's this back and forth between a thesis and an antithesis, or between different sorts of ideas that we try out, we sample, and discover their inadequacy, and then come up with some sort of synthesis. The dialectic, or the conversation of faith, is the finest, most remarkable of all. It possesses an elevation, of which indeed I can form a conception, but nothing more. If I am able to make from the springboard the great leap, right, the leap of faith, whereby I pass into infinity. My back is like that of a tightrope dancer, having been twisted in my childhood. Hence I find this easy with a 1, 2, 3. It's a leap, right? So let's unpack that a little bit. What's happening is that Abraham is moving beyond ethics. He's moving beyond the universal, all right, this universal code of ethics, and he's taking this leap. All right, now this is not simple, and it's not necessarily rational either. Kierkegaard continues, the whole earthly form he exhibits is a new creation by virtue of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely, and then he grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. He constantly makes the movements of infinity, but he does this with such correctness and assurance that he constantly gets the finite out of it, and there is not a second when one has a notion of anything else. It is supposed to be the most difficult task for a dancer to leap into a definite posture in such a way that there is not a second when he is grasping after the posture, but by the leap itself he stands fixed in that posture. Perhaps no dancer can do it. That is what the knight of faith does. Right? The knight of faith. So Abraham, for Kierkegaard, is a kind of hero of faith. Now, if you want another kind of account of that, you see that in the New Testament, in Paul's letter to the Romans, in chapter 4 of Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul describes a lot about how Abraham believed God, and that was Abraham's righteousness. It wasn't necessarily Abraham's commitment to ethics that was his righteousness. It was Abraham's faith that was his righteousness. And Kierkegaard is making a similar step here. Now, I want to take a step aside and affirm. I also, like personally, I don't find this adequate or a viable way of thinking about faith. Partially because it can lead to a lot of major difficulties that we have seen in recent memory, where there are people who do feel convicted and genuinely convicted and perplexed, and that they feel that dread, and then they go ahead and they commit murder, I would say, out of faith. I think that there are too many examples of this for me personally to adhere to Kierkegaard's view on this, or to accept it. Right? It's just a little bit of an aside. So if you find yourself rejecting Kierkegaard, by all means, reject Kierkegaard. But at the same time, if you find that Kierkegaard helps you to reconcile the paradoxes that you find yourself in between ethics and faith, or between beauty and faith, if Kierkegaard helps you reconcile that, then awesome. That's part of what this course is for, right? To help you kind of orient yourself existentially. Okay, the teleological suspension of the ethical. I gotta go faster here. But I just want to make sure that we kind of like take this in. I'm going to unpack this phrase, and then we'll read a little bit of the text. Teleological means goal-based, right? If something is teleological, that means that it has some sort of purpose, some sort of purpose like beyond what we might ordinarily think is the regular goal of life, right? So it's not just a mundane purpose, or okay, my purpose right now is to explain this text to you. That might be a purpose, but there could be a higher purpose, a sort of a higher goal beyond the ethical. All right, so here there's a purpose, and we suspend the ethical. There's a suspension of the ethical. So the ethical would prevent Abraham from killing Isaac, but we are suspending that ethical principle for the sake of a higher purpose, for a higher telos, a higher goal. Right? Kierkegaard writes, faith is precisely this paradox, that the individual as the particular is higher than the universal, is justified over against it, is not subordinate to the universal, but superior to the universal, over the universal. Yet in such a way be it observed that it is the particular individual who, after he has been subordinated as the particular to the universal, now through the universal becomes the individual who as the particular is superior to the universal, for the fact that the individual as a particular stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. All right, now that's a bit of a mouthful, but it is in one's attachment to the absolute, in other words, to God, that one is able to surpass ethics. Let me take a faith is its paradox. Let me take a bit of an aside and refer to something else that relates to the Gospels. You might be familiar with some of what Jesus had described about how, and Paul also, after Jesus, had described how we are no longer under the law, but rather under grace. There is a kind of new covenant. We no longer need to operate according to law, but rather now we are in a intimate enough relationship with God that we can live by faith, right? And this is a very deeply Christian step, and Kierkegaard is definitely an intensely Christian existentialist, right? Now, this is before people started to call it existentialism, but nevertheless, Kierkegaard is deeply finding a resolution to that absurdity in his faith, and in his Christian faith. Of course, also that includes the story of Abraham. So, all right. In the interest of time, this is becoming very long. So, I'm just going to cut to the end. I return to Abraham. Before the result, either Abraham was every minute a murderer, or we are confronted by a paradox which is higher than all mediation. The story of Abraham contains, therefore, a teleological suspension of the ethical. As the individual, he became higher than the universal. This is the paradox which does not permit of mediation. It is just as inexplicable how he got into it as it is inexplicable how he remained in it. If such is not the position of Abraham, then he is not even a tragic hero, but a murderer. Right? So in order for Abraham to be a knight of faith instead of a murderer, we explain his actions as a goal-based pursuit of faith and pursuit of relationship with God and connection with God and obedience to God that surpasses or transcends universal ethics. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'm sorry for the long video, but I hope you found this edifying, and I hope this was a helpful introduction to an overview of Kierkegaard's thinking.